Hello, I'm Daniela. In today's video, we're going to stitch a very interesting and 3D textile flower. Now, I say stitch, there's not very many stitches involved. This is a very simple flower to make, but it's very interesting. It's got a lot of texture, a lot of ruffles for the petals, and then I use a button for the center. You can use this as a standalone brooch with just putting a pin on the back and a little bit of felt to hold it in place, or you can use it in your slow stitching. I show you two examples of how I use them, but I think they're beautiful. I use them made out of neutral fabrics, but of course you can vary this as you see fit. And I like the idea of using a wooden button or a neutral colored button as the center of my flower. I just think it makes it a little whimsical. So let's get started creating these.
So these are the floppy fabric flowers. They're very simple to make. They don't require very much stitching. It's just a lot of basting for the leaf, but the rest of it is fairly easy. It's just about cutting up the fabric. I like to use a neutral button to go with my neutral fabric here. And as you can see, I have lots of layers. This kind of reminds me of the gardenia. But you can use as many layers as you want. You can use any color fabric. You don't have to stick with a neutral scheme. I even took some green fabric here and I had tea dyed it, so it looked very muted, and I really just liked that look. But again, if that's not your look, if you want something bold or you patterned, feel free to change this up. And you can even make one much larger. It's a really fun thing. This would look cute on a pillow. I used a different type of fabric for the leaves here, and this is the back. I just stitched this on the back in case I wanted to pin it onto something, and I'll show you that technique at the very end. So to get started, we need our supplies. I'm just going to use muslin for my fabric, and then I have some of this green fabric and a button. So now I have lots of size buttons here to use for the center. Obviously, if I was making a much larger flower, this button or even this one would come in handy. Today I'm going to make a smaller one, a little smaller than the ones I showed as an example. So this is about, I don't know, maybe 3 inches across. I'm going to make it a little smaller. So what I need to do is start with my fabric here, and this is just muslin. It's not even ironed or anything like this. Because it's very thin, I can cut multiple layers at a time, which saves me some time. So I'm just going to fold it in half, and I'll make a cut here. And this is the longest length of the petals. And then I'll just cut it this way. So now I have 4 ply of fabric. This just makes it easier. You can cut them individually if you want. I wanted my largest piece to be approximately this button size. So I'll cut this fabric some more. I'll just cut it into a manageable square. And then I'll cut it down. And I want the length of my fabric, that will be the length of the petal. Because I'm going to round the edge, I like to make it a little bit larger than here. This will give me 2 or maybe even 3 cuts across. So I'm just going to eyeball it, cutting across so that I have a bunch of these little rectangles. Maybe I'll just do one more set over here. Again, just eyeballing the size. I'm approximately trying to get it the same size. I have the length here. So now that I have all my little pieces here, I want to round the edges. I'll just take a bunch of them, maybe 4 or 5. This happens to be a very thin material. I line them up and I just round the edges. This shaves it down a little bit, but it gives me that curled edge. So I'll cut all of them approximately that size. If some get a little smaller, that's totally okay. So now I have all my petals, my scraps. Get rid of the scraps. And for the petals, just because it's not exact, which is totally fine, I like to just spread them out. And I kind of just look for the ones that are smaller or longer or need to be trimmed. These two aren't exactly rounded, so I'll just tidy those up. And then I just spread them out. And then I just quickly eyeball the largest ones. And those will be my base. So I make just a little plus sign by crossing them over. And then I just start layering them. And I quickly just look for the largest ones. And I can always cut them down again. If it's really large, I can put it on the base. And I just play around until I have a really full design. I think I'll just take a couple of these and just trim them down a little further. And there I have petals for the top. So I have about 9 or 10 layers here. What I want to do now is just take my thread, it can be any color thread. I have just a greenish gray. I kind of went for a thread color similar to the leaf color. Just going to hold it up, and I'm just going to tack down a couple of little stitches in the center just to hold this in place. Now this step is optional. You can just jump right to using your button if you want, but I like to just tack it down. I have 2 strands of embroidery floss on my needle, so it's not very clunky or chunky. So now that my flower is held together, you can see on the back I have my needle, just a couple of stitches. Now I'll choose the button I want to use. I can use a much larger button, but I'm going to go with that little small button. I think that's precious. So I'll hold the button in place and stitch that down. Now this not only is an accent piece, but it does hold the flower together. It reinforces it. So I like to do that 2 or 3 times through the buttonhole. And then just to really anchor it, and then I like to anchor my thread in place with a knot, and I'll trim the thread, and then I'll work on the leaf. Now by having all those layers of petals and really stitching that button tight, it kind of makes a natural little curl here, just a slight little curl of the flower. And I like that, it gives a little bit of a dimension. So now to make the leaf. I don't want my leaf to be very large, and you can make as many as you want. What I like to do is take a strip of fabric. This is a lot thicker than I would imagine I need. So it's at least the width of this flower. And then I just want to make my petal. I like to fold the top of that fabric to a point. I'm just finger pressing it here. And I have just a slight little overlap. This is completely optional. So it comes to a point up top here. I'll take some thread and just make a few little stitches to tack this triangle in place. And they're just little stitches, they won't really show, but they do hold that triangle closed. Now from there, when my thread is still attached, I'll just fold over the edge. You can determine how much you want to fold over. I'm going to fold over both sides. Again, I finger press it into place. And so I have something that looks like a little leaf sticking out. I'll take my thread, add a few little stitches to tack it down so that the fabric doesn't come unfolded. And I'll stitch right down the sides to hold down that fold in the leaf. This gives a little more dimension. Again, the stitches are little and I'm using muted thread. Then I'll come over here and just make a few stitches to tack it down to hold it in place. And you can make as many leaves as you want using this technique. Now I like to keep my thread attached here after I have it all set down before I knot it or cut it off. And then I could play around with how much of the fabric I want to stick out from the flower. So that's pretty good. I like the way this pokes out here. I'll flip it over here and I'll just eyeball, knowing that I want to cut it out to here. And now I'll just take this and round this piece. So it just follows the curve of that flower. And that's what it will look like. Flip my piece over. I have my thread coming out of my leaf section. And now I'll just grab a few petals on the bottom, just 2 or 3, and make little stitches stitching through them. And this will hold my leaf in place. Just little stitches, kind of a basting stitch. It doesn't have to be perfect. And I'll just continue to go around that back of that flower. If you pull it, you get a little tension. It adds a little interest to that flower. It's a very rustic design, very simple. The key is just to hold it in place. And once I have that tacked down very well, I'll just knot off my thread right here on the end of this leaf. So there I have a beautiful little flower. I can use it in my slow stitching and add it to a piece. So it's like this. So this piece is starting to come together. Not quite sure what direction it will go in, but I have a little flower here. I can continue adding little flowers to make them look like they're on a vine. Or I could take this piece and make it into like a little brooch. There's a very simple way to do that. You can find hardware at the craft store to make this into a brooch. It's a little pin backing. You just stitch it on. I like to use a safety pin and a little bit of felt. And the way that I do that is I make a little backing. So again, I'll just take something to give me a size approximate. In this case, it's this button. And I want to just cut around this button to make it the approximate shape that I'll need for the backing. Now the backing is important because it reinforces the flower yet again, and this is what I'm going to pin through, is really the felt and not the fabric. I don't want it to show that little pin if I'm using this on a hat or a bag or even a lapel. And I take that circle and I'm going to put it right back to cover that leaf. And again, I choose a few leaves. I'll take my needle and thread, and coming from underneath the felt first, just make a little stitch to hide the knot, tuck the knot, and then I just grab a few of these little petals and I make little stitches just to hold the felt onto the petals. I'll continue all the way around, sort of at the edge of the felt, but not the very edge. I have a little bit of an 1/8 inch or so lip. Again, I just continue stitching around. You can knot that needle wherever you want, just like a little knot there. It's discreet. And now I can just take my safety pin, because I just find this easy and convenient and I have them on hand, and I'll poke it through the felt. And again, you choose a size safety pin that works for you and what you have on hand. And now I can just pin this to whatever object I want, a hat or a purse. Now you can vary this again by choosing the fabric or the buttons or even the color and the different type of print for the leaves. You get different effects. I think it's a beautiful, simple little flower that adds a little bit of interest, and it was sparked by the gardenia in my garden.
So that's how I create my fabric floppy flower. I think it's a pretty flower. It's very rustic, it's whimsical, somewhat realistic because it has all those petals, but clearly it's a little abstract too. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe. Thanks for joining me today.